Now, United Nations researchers have made their strongest statement yet on the impact of climate change in a key report setting out how the world's oceans, ice caps and land could change in the next decade. It's a study that's given the starkest warning so far about the need to cut emissions. Correspondents say that whereas in the past scientists were reluctant to ascribe extreme events such as heat waves and torrential rain to be at least partly down to climate change, now in the case of the heat dome in the US and the floods in Europe, China and elsewhere, they are confident in saying it would have been almost impossible without climate change. But the research does confirm that if politicians stick to holding global temperature increases to 1.5 degrees Celsius, the worst catastrophe can still be avoided.
Climate Change 2021, the physical science basis expands our knowledge of attribution of climate change, including the human contribution to extreme weather events. And it provides us with an improved understanding of climate change, including warming, past, present, and future. First, it tells us that it is indisputable that human activities are causing climate change and making extreme weather events more frequent and severe. Second, it shows that climate change is affecting every region on our planet. And lastly, it explains that strong, rapid, sustained reductions in carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions would be required to limit global warming.
So we've known for decades that the world is warming, but this report tells us that recent changes in the climate are widespread, rapid, and intensifying, unprecedented in thousands of years. For example, this report tells us that each of the past 4 decades has been the warmest on record since pre-industrial times. Further, it is indisputable that human activities are causing climate change. Human influence is making extreme climate events, including heat waves, heavy rainfall, and droughts, more frequent and severe. What's new in this report is that we can now attribute many more changes at the global and regional level to human influence. But the bottom line is that unless there are immediate, rapid, and large-scale reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, limiting warming to 1.5 degrees C or 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit will be beyond reach. The report shows that in the next 20 years, global average temperature is expected to reach or exceed 1.5 degrees C above pre-industrial levels.
Well, for more on this, I'm joined now by the globally recognized scholar on environmental policy and climate change, Professor Chukwumerije Okereke, who's a UN scientist who served as a former co-director of the Center for Climate and Justice in the UK and is a member of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the UN body that produced this report. Thank you very much indeed, Professor Okereke, for joining us. A crucial climate change report, very significant, I gather, at the moment. Just give us a sense of where, in your assessment, the science of that report is pointing. Is all this extreme weather caused by us?
Thank you for having me, Charles. Well, one of the strongest evidence that we have has been presented now by this report, that human beings are responsible for the extreme weather events and in general for the extreme unprecedented climate impact that we've been experiencing globally. And one of the strongest evidences we have come from the ensemble of modeling, as well as advances in paleoclimate science, in particular understanding of how the ice sea core have been melting in the past decades or so. And so the growth in attribution science has allowed the UNN scientists to be able to say now without equivocation that human beings are generally responsible for some of the extreme weather events that we have seen in the past decade. And this is what makes this report very, very alarming.
Now, you know a lot more about these things than we do. You're a member of that IPCC panel. You're a UN acknowledged, recognized scientist that deals with climate change. How do they go about assembling this kind of report? I mean, it's obviously a massive event. I understand they've been basically doing it off and on for the last 8 years.
This is one of the most rigorous, most meticulous scientific review processes you can ever imagine. It starts by assembling the best of brains in various aspects of climate science: the ocean, the cryosphere, the atmosphere, the biosphere, the land, where these scientists are assembled, chosen from all the countries in the world. And then they start a very rigorous process of assessing the latest evidence based on peer-reviewed literature. And then there are 3 periods in the process where the draft reports are sent to all the scientists around the world to make their review comments. And then we, the authors of the report, have to respond to every comment that is made across the world. In some cases, we have as much as 15,000 comments, which we have to meticulously respond to. And when we have responded to all those comments, we produce a semi-finalized draft, which goes back to the government to have the last read. And then the summary the summary for policymakers report, which is the one that was released today, is then negotiated line by line, projected on a big screen, and all the government functionaries and scientists will read every line and debate on those lines before you get what you just have today as the accepted report. So this is rigorous, this is robust, this is unequivocal. Nobody that really knows what they are doing in the scientific community can doubt that we have now come to a state where human beings are responsible for the large part of the climatic catastrophe that we are witnessing around the globe.
And I mean, in addition to obviously being a mammoth task, listening to the way that you've described it, what is equally important about this is the comprehensive nature of the membership of that panel. I understand that in addition to the scientists, virtually every country in the world has a representative on that panel. So nobody can say that we were not aware of, from first-hand information of what the conclusions of that panel were.
Exactly so. I mean, apart from following climate governance very closely over the past 20 years, some of us have also argued for better representation of scientists in the IPCC. And I'm glad that some of our arguments have now been taken very seriously, and the IPCC now makes sure as much as possible that there is representation in terms of the number of states or nations around the world, but also that there is equal balance in terms of gender, male and females, because of the various ways, the gender sensitivity of climate science. But also there is balance in terms of established scientists and younger scientists. So there are all sorts of different balances. But you are absolutely right that the membership is cut across all the nations in the world. And because we are speaking from Nigeria, I also want to say that actually we don't have enough representation of Nigerian scientists as we would like to be. I would like to see many more Nigerians joining me as part of the UN scientists on climate assessment. But for now, I think that the emphasis is that this science is unequivocal, it is irrefutable, it is beyond doubt that we now have a strengthened attribution to climate change, and that human beings are responsible for the bulk of the climate change that we have seen in the past decade. You see, the recent rate of sea level rise has tripled compared to what we have between 1901 and 1971. The last 5 years has been the warmest on record. In Nigeria, we saw and we have seen unprecedented level of flooding cutting across maybe 32 out of the 36 states. This is not natural. Something is happening, and human beings are mostly responsible. We have to change the way we get our energy and the way we use our energy. Otherwise, the globe, the earth, may not be conducive for a life as we know it in the next 20 to 30 years.
Well, I have to say that that's a pretty frightening report. But let's just be clear on the fact that that report is up to date with what is happening at the moment, including from the heat waves, the droughts, the wildfires, the heavy downpours, the coastal flooding. All that covered in this report?
Exactly. So because of the emphasis on comprehensiveness in assembling the climate scientists that deal with this report, with the United Nations is very, very particular in making sure that we have good representation of scientists that are focusing on land, on the ocean, on the cryosphere, on the biosphere, and the atmosphere, on sea level rise as well. So I have a lot of my friends who are experts in oceans, on land, in cryosphere, and other parts of climate change. So every bit is being covered, and every bit have been scrutinized with a tooth comb, if you like, to ensure accuracy and comprehensiveness. This is a rich report that covers all aspects of the climate and makes a very, very damning, provocative assessment of where things are and calls for immediate action in order to avert the disasters that await us.
Well, we're going to talk about that action that's needed because, I mean, just listening to you assess it and listening to all the other scientists who were part of that panel, I mean, it sounds as though there's not much we can do. But do stay with us. We're going to come back and talk more about that. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our assessment of that hard-hitting report on climate change released by UN climate scientists. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Aniagolu. Now, the world's largest ever report on climate change has just been published, setting out the stark reality of the state of the planet. It's been put together by the UN scientific body known as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and it's got lots of bad news with some nuggets of optimism. But overall, it's a hard-hitting report, the hardest hitting yet, on the impact of humans on the weather and what the weather will do to humans. As forests burn, rivers burst their banks, and cities and towns are deluged by floods, they say it's no longer climate change, it's climate chaos. To put it bluntly, the world is on the verge of burning up, and where the science is pointing suggests that this extreme weather is caused in large part by the activities of humans. And with me on the line, the globally recognized scholar on environmental policy and climate change, Professor Chukwumerije Okereke, who's also a member of the IPCC, the UN body that produced that doomsday climate report. Thank you very much indeed, Professor, for staying with us. Now, these reports have been controversial before. I mean, they've been challenged for some of the science that it's come up with. I mean, is there likely to be pushback this time, or is this report absolutely unarguable in your assessment?
I think you're right that there has been some challenge of the IPCC report in the past. But quite frankly, as I indicated in our last segment, there is no scientist that knows his onions, that is what, his name. And I will argue that the weather and the climate has been changing in an unprecedented ways over many centuries and over many thousands of years. And so, yes, there probably could well be some pushback, but I don't expect it to change anything. There are always some scientists at the fringes that would like to draw some attention to themselves by trying to cast aspersions or doubt on the integrity of the IPCC report. The IPCC report, as we saw in the last segment, is one of the most robust and rigorous assessment you can ever get. And the strength of this report comes from the meticulous nature of the process that it goes through and the quality of scientists that write it. 98% of the global scientists have agreed that unequivocally the climate is changing and that human beings are largely responsible. So I don't foresee a loud noise from the climate denials at all.
So, given that there appears to be absolute consensus from the scientists who I understand came from 185 countries, it seems like rather than argue against the science, the real danger now is to delay action on the decarbonization of the global economy.
Exactly so, because quite frankly, a lot of what has been made clear in this report, we have known for a number of years, even though, as we indicated, the level of understanding of the attribution has strengthened since AR5, since the last 5 years. But quite frankly, we've known. I was part of the global scientists that produced the 1.5 report, which you and I discussed a couple of years ago. But what we have seen is that the understanding of the climate science does not always result in a greater action across the globe. And so there is a disjoint between the scientific understanding and the political action or economic action that is required to deal with the problem. So I'm hoping that this report, especially coming in the run-up of COP 26 in the UK, could help to influence rapid and large-scale action from across the government. Because as we indicated, all the scenarios show that to stay within 1.5 to 2 degrees warming, there has to be an unprecedented level of deep decarbonization or reduction in greenhouse gas emission. And this requires massive collaboration and cooperation and effort from the lowest, the local government, up onto the highest scale, which is the global community.
Now, you mentioned COP26 there. Does this report set the agenda for that climate conference? I mean, that crucial climate, those crucial talks with world leaders, which is taking place, I believe, in Glasgow in the autumn.
Well, I certainly hope it does. I mean, the gap between the collective or cumulative pledges made by all countries in their what we call in their nationally determined contribution has been known to be hugely lower than what is required to keep global warming 1.5 or 2 degrees. Effort to get countries to scale up their ambition has not been very successful. But of course, both the US and the UK that will be hosting the COP26 have made increasing ambition one of their priorities. So I'm hoping that this report helps them to see the need to double down on that commitment to not only increase their mitigation pledges, but to also give support to developing countries to find ways of decarbonizing their economies while also growing or increasing their ability to supply what is required for the good life. And so I'm hoping that this report will catalyze some radical action at the global level come November this year.
Well, let's talk about that, Professor, because in the past there have been similar but maybe not so urgent warnings, and they've not panicked politicians into taking the kind of action that the scientists are calling for. Why is it going to be different this time? I mean, is the fact that the message is more scary this time going to panic and push the politicians?
That's a good point, Charlie. I mean, one of the things that I'm hoping will make a difference this time is that For a long time, those of us who are climate scientists from the developing countries have been saying to them, look, our people are dying as a result of climate change. The flooding, extreme weather events, heat waves are killing our people. And for some reasons, it has been difficult for them to really understand what we're talking about, because most of the countries that have been historically and even currently responsible for climate change have a very robust economic and ecological and governance systems that have made them sort of very low risk in terms of, or less vulnerable to climate change than we are. But look at what has happened in the last 4 years. Look at the unprecedented scale of flooding in Germany. Look at the unprecedented scale of wildfire in Australia and the US. And even in the US now, we also experience very large amount of droughts. And so we are hoping, I'm not proud to say this, I'm not happy, but sometimes I think, well, maybe this catastrophe has come to the doorsteps of those who have the power and the economic muscle to do something. I hope it wakes them up. But because we don't have to wait until this catastrophe comes to our doorstep for us to recognize that millions, or at least hundreds of thousands of people in poor countries are already dying as a result of climate change. So I'm hoping that now that the catastrophe, the unprecedented events is at their doorstep, look at the heat wave that we have in France and we continue to have in some parts of other Europe. I am hoping that they will wake up. By the way, it's also important to recognize some of the efforts that have been done by or made by these countries. The cost of renewable technology has fallen over 80% in the last 5 to 7 years. And many countries have now scaled up their climate ambition. Over 14 countries around the world have indicated that they will not buy or use fossil fuel in their jurisdiction from 2025, 2030 above.
Okay,
so there are a lot
Professor,
of
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we're actually literally out of time, but absolutely brilliant as always to talk with you, and thank you for putting this in clear perspective for us. Professor Chukwumerije Okereke is a member of the IPCC, the UN body that produced that climate report.